Hello and welcome to a special edition of Frontline and Superpowers with me, Philip Ingram.
And me, James Heappey. Today we're going to bring you a roundup of everything that's happened in 2025. And it's been quite a year, which means, like so many of the episodes that we've recorded this year, we have to timestamp the content. We're recording this in the first week of December. And fingers crossed that by the time you watch it, everything we say is still relevant. Because, Philip, there have been some weeks this year where you record something in the morning and by the afternoon it's been out of date.
Well, exactly. But everything that we say will be relevant. You know, we know that. Anyway.
It'll be genius, insightful and wonderful, which is why people tune in to watch. But who knows whether by the time people watch it, there will have been a peace deal in Ukraine or whatever. Who knows?
Well, I doubt that'll happen. So let's go back and let's start at the beginning of 2025 as the world waited with bated breath as Donald Trump was inaugurated into Washington, D.C. You know, we had the Doge with Elon Musk. What's happening Elon these days? Cutting US aid. We are beginning to feel the ramifications of this. And was that the time to start to cut soft power?
I oscillate wildly, and I have guests on who speak very eloquently in their criticism of Trump, and others will come on and say, sometimes grudgingly, that what he's doing is moving the dial. I think that it's probably too soon to make any firm judgment. USAID. There was a great deal of stuff that it did that was wonderful around that. There were other things that were frankly irrelevant. Some of the things he's promised, if you remember when he came to power in Ukraine was going to be done in a day.
Oh, of course.
Gaza was going to be done in a week. And, these are, a year later, we're not done in either of those places.
Well, yeah, and my view on USAID is I can see why Donald Trump was doing it because of the wastage that was going on and the lack of control. But the difficulty is when you've got something, even if it's not running as efficiently as it could be, it's having an effect. And you withdraw it and it creates a vacuum. That vacuum's going to be filled. And that vacuum, I fear, is being filled by additional Russian influence, but more importantly, Chinese influence.
Yes.
And this is where we could be building up a longer-term danger.
I mean, I think this is the danger of US isolationism generally, to be honest, and an isolationist trend that predates Trump, but no doubt has been accelerated by him. And I think when you go to Washington, as I often do, most people understand that the world isn't standing still waiting for American re-engagement. But I do think that the cost of that is rarely considered. That if the US seeks to not influence, not maintain its sphere, not be a friend and ally to countries that are in the balance between the Chinese and US sphere, then out of necessity, those countries will move on and will strengthen their relationships elsewhere, and the US loses out from them.
But at the same time, the UK signalled cuts in international aid, and therefore you're bringing all of this together. It's sending, is that sending the right message out to the international community, especially to an expansionist China and Vladimir Putin that's looking for opportunities to exploit?
Well, when I was a minister, I felt very much that my travels were, they would have a tactical purpose to rally people to the Ukrainian cause or to, maintain the cause of British friendship. But fundamentally, what I was doing was seeking to preserve a rules-based international order which enjoyed the consent of a Western-aligned sphere. I think the Russians, and particularly the Chinese, are so patient and so effective at eroding that sphere, and with tangible effect. If you look at voting in the UN, if you look at the composition of key committees or the governance of global fora, from the IMF to the WTO or whatever else, you see this relentless rise of Chinese influence. And so whilst I genuinely think that the efficacy of Trump's foreign policy in year one of his presidency still can't really be judged, I do think that the core proposition of the US retreating from the world, not needing to roll it, not believing in the importance of US soft power, is a mistake, and that the world is changing irreversibly as a consequence.
Well, a theme I think we'll come on to as we go through this. Trump is thinking in short-termism. He knows he's got a finite presidency, whereas China and Russia are thinking in multi-generational terms. But, and this is surprises me, 3 years into the into the Ukraine-Russian conflict, February, we had that explosive incident in the Oval Office in the White House, the meeting between Trump and Zelensky, where it was an ambush. You can't describe it any other way. What are your thoughts?
I couldn't believe it. You just, like, sometimes, moments play out in almost in slow motion, right? And you just can't quite believe you're watching the president of Ukraine, who for 2 years prior has kind of walked on water, really, globally. I remember when he came to Parliament and there was a standing ovation, and and the world has rallied to his cause. I mean, inspired by his wartime leadership. Mm-hmm. And then there he is being beaten up for not turning up to the Oval Office in a jacket and tie, and really taken to the cleaners by particularly J.D. Vance. Yep. And bear in mind that that moment in the Oval Office was just weeks after Vance's speech at the Munich Security Conference, which again was incredibly provocative. Yep. And that was only weeks after that extraordinary speech in Paris, which I think was the first time most of us had really seen him. The difficulty is that Zelensky's attire notwithstanding, Vance has a knack of slightly holding up a mirror to Europe and to the Ukrainians. And there were things about the pace at which Zelensky was choosing not to mobilise the whole of Ukrainian society that were a fair cop when Vance challenged him. And 100% his Munich Security Conference speech about the lack of European investment and urgency in their defence was justified. So the manner in which all of this stuff is done, I find as unpalatable as anybody. But there's always just that nugget of truth to it that's awkward to hear.
So, from a diplomacy perspective, from how ministers go about their business in traditional methods, it doesn't seem to achieve much apart from more talk. But the one thing that we can say about Trump and Trump's team, and was exemplified by this, it's certainly shaking things up. How uncomfortable is that making other world leaders, do you think?
I think they find it incredibly hard. And I can imagine, if you had been commentating on us, as the UK government, doing something that unilaterally, that provocative, that sort of out with normal logic and reason, you as a commentator would have been lampooning us. And
what would have been on in cabinet? You put yourself into that happening, and suddenly there's an emergency cabinet meeting to try and discuss what's happened.
Well, I served under three prime ministers, all had their strengths and weaknesses. I can't imagine. I mean, it is a style of government that is so idiosyncratic that I can't translate any of my experiences to that. I just people say to me that is there a genius to it? Maybe. I mean, there is a logic that insanity is doing the same thing over and over again, expecting a different result, and the mechanisms of global diplomacy are awfully repetitive. So Trump's approach might be different, but I do think that Steve Witkoff is sometimes guilty of being led up the path by those he's seeking to be an interlocutor with. I think there are moments when you just double take and you sort of spot that, Trump's son-in-law has rocked up on the delegation to Moscow. And you just this is not diplomacy by normal rules.
I think we'll hit Witkoff and Jared Kushner a little later on. But we'll put Vance into his place. We then get into March, and we've got Signalgate, and Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of State for Defence. And I can say defence because it was before he became the Secretary of State for War, having renamed the department, being renamed. Not that Congress has approved that, I understand. A good year for him. Do we think he's secure in his position after Signalgate and various other controversies? And he seems to have disappeared currently off the radar, or is he focused on other things like Venezuela?
I don't know. I mean, I've picked up all this chat that isn't the Secretary of the Army doing well, and is he being positioned to replace Hegseth? I suspect not. I think there have been some moments when Hegseth has done stuff that I've thought pretty amazing, like flying in every 4-star general from all over the world to issue them with a bit of a bollocking about, sort of fitness standards and stuff. That just felt a bit odd. But
does that not happen to the Minister of Defence every week?
I suspect that there would have been a 2-word answer given in unison by all of the UK's senior officers if any Secretary of State had tried to bring them in for that.
For those that aren't aware, that second word would definitely have been off.
It would have been, yes, and the first would have rhymed with something.
Ofcom might say something to us.
Peter Hegseth is a loyalist. He's a fantastic communicator, and I am told that around the US military, he's pretty popular. I've heard about when he goes overseas, and I know people that have travelled with him in his entourage, and they speak actually very fondly of a guy that will always get up early to go and do fizz with the troops first thing. Soldier, fundamentally has the kind of war-fighting ability of the US military front of mind, and although I don't think he's given us a ton of evidence of this, apparently he's an intellect too. So exactly.
My concern is that yes, I can see he's a soldier, and I can see from a leader's perspective he'll get on with the soldiers very well. Being a soldier does not necessarily mean that you are the right person to lead such a powerful, large department of state from a political perspective, translating that political military interface that you're there, because it's very different commanding troops and working at that political level as you've seen.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, one of the things that I found really challenging was I didn't know the other service chiefs that were fired on the basis that they were Biden diversity hires, but I thought that the firing of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who I had worked with when I'd been to Ramstein meetings and things, and he was very different to Mark Milley, no doubt. An Air Force officer and Army officers always are going to come at things in a slightly different approach. But
we always agree.
But I didn't like, when you arrive and the first thing you do is fire the chairman of the Joint Chiefs and a few others. That is a political intrusion into the military that I was uncomfortable with. That's not to say that Dan Kane isn't a fantastic chairman, and someone like Hegseth needs a certain style of chairman, I suspect, to kind of underpin the effort. But I really didn't like that some very senior people came to the end of their careers over allegations of them being, diversity hires under Biden. Whether that's true or not, discuss. But you don't just come into office and fire them anyway.
Yeah, interestingly, it's a very business approach. I remember when I was in commercial business and we took over a company, all of the senior management were interviewed and fired and replaced. And therefore, you're given Donald Trump's focus on business. Maybe that was a tactic that was being used, not reflection on the competency of the officers, but just trying to put a different message in a brutal way.
Look, and if he'd come in and just said, look, in business, it's standard practice to shake up the senior management as a first order of business, that's what I'm doing, that would almost have been an easier thing to have said. But the suggestion was that these people were not good enough to have warranted the appointments that they won, and that therefore they needed to be fired. And I just thought that was a shame, really.
And especially as their appointments in the United States, unlike the UK, are approved by Congress once you get into start office. So that was a bit of a dig at Congress's approval process.
That's a great point, yeah.
We then get into April, tariffs. Oh my goodness, tariffs. What do you think the impact on the US and global economies were of Trump's approach to tariffs?
I mean, look, like all fiscal events, the pain was in the build-up, right?
Yeah.
This day was going to come when absolute economic Armageddon was going to be unleashed, and there was a sort of Damocles hanging over global trade in the run-up. In the end, for the UK at least, the tariff was nowhere near as bad. And it's strange that our ambassador in Washington, who has subsequently met his end in some disgrace, At the time, was credited.
I didn't hear anything about that at all.
But at the time, he was credited with having played an absolute blinder in terms of making the UK's case. And some degree of pragmatism won through in that they then did this stay of execution whilst lots of other countries got caught up with the UK in terms of stating their case. I still think to the first part of our conversation when we were exploring briefly the sort of degradation of US soft power, the US as a beacon of free trade and sort of the anchor of the global economy has taken a massive hit by the idea of tariffs. And I'm sure they're going to be fiscally very beneficial to the US exchequer, but again, at some cost to the US's global influence.
Well, and at some impact on the polarization across the globe, because I think the uncertainty that it's created will have polarized a lot of countries to move away from necessarily relying on US business and potentially looking at China or other areas, and therefore creating that polarization. And I think the other thing, from my perspective, is that it's completely undermined the US defense industry, because as the tariffs were coming in, we were getting restrictions on, or talk of restrictions in use of weapons and everything else, and therefore that's a bonus for the European defense industry, who aren't imposing those restrictions. And whilst America's trying to sell more, Europe's been building up its capability.
Yes.
And the tariffs aren't having the same sort of impact, and Europe is not putting the same, you cannot use this here, there, and everywhere, and we'll just sell it to you and you use it the way you want to. And that, I think, is an own goal by Donald Trump.
Yeah, I see that. It's again a really interesting point. Do you think that do you think that this is going to be a persistent and cross-party approach to US trade? If it proves to be so lucrative, and it sort of drives a re-onshoring of industry, it might be quite hard for the next administration to abandon it.
I think you're right. I think once they see the money that's coming in, but if it's also caused damage in international trade, it's then going to have to focus more on US internal trade and what's going on there. And if Europe becomes resurgent in its defence output in particular, which it will do in 5 years' time, then I think that's going to cause real problems in the United States. And this is where I think, when it comes to Donald Trump's approach to Ukraine and the billions of dollars that are being held in European banks, Donald Trump's not going to want to move away from Europe buying US weapons as part of any deal, because he wants money today, he wants deals today, and that's what's driving him.
Yeah, although I felt all year long that Trump sort of slightly defies gravity in that sense. Like, you would, no matter how hard he tries to sort of affront the Europeans collectively, and I think this is the only answer, have decided that every time they go to Washington, or when Trump comes to the UK on a state visit or whatever else, they're going to bend the knee and show him. So there's always a big announcement around UK investment in a US defence technology or a US company. France and Germany have done the same, particularly Germany, and so you might be right that the European defence industry mobilises to such a degree that US sales into Europe just noticeably decline. But I think a lot of European leaders have figured that the price for continued US engagement in NATO is contracts to US companies.
Yeah. But again, I remember the old adage in the military, and I'll not name any cap badges in this, but whenever someone's coming up and shaking you by the hand and giving you a big hug, they're actually checking down your vertebra to see where to insert the knife. That's in there, so maybe that could be it. But we move on, and we're now getting into the summer of 2025, and June, the summer saw the deployment of the US National Guard into various US cities, deploying US troops onto the streets of US cities. From a military perspective, from a political military perspective, how big was this? How significant is this?
One of my favourite episodes of Superpowers all year, actually, was a really unexpected one where a Major General from the US National Guard joined me and offered his reflections. And I just thought he was really eloquent about what the deployment of the Guard means, to American society, to the institution that is the Guard, and that very worrying blurring of the lines between the military operating on the back of a legal order versus the politicization of the military. I also offered in that episode that when I'd been in Washington back in sort of January, February, DuPont Circle had been full of people taking drugs. It stank of drugs. It felt quite edgy to be there. I didn't feel entirely safe. And when I was back in the summer, there were National Guardsmen walking around. Everything was completely different. The problem is that in the last few weeks, indeed since that conversation, we've seen some guardsmen being killed, literally just around the corner from there.
Two attacked and one unfortunately died.
And that you just, when you deploy the military at home, you got to be. It's not without cost. And in this particular case, it's required the ultimate price that people pay.
We saw the difficulties of putting the military on the streets of the United Kingdom with what went on in Northern Ireland.
Well, yes, exactly. That's a very good example.
We've got fantastic experience.
It really shouldn't be done lightly. And who are we to judge American politics? We're two Brits sat in a pub in London, but I think it's that is quite something to have done.
But I think from an outside perspective, it's good to raise question marks over things, and hopefully anyone who's watching can put their comments underneath, and we can pick those up in subsequent episodes of both Frontline and Superpowers if they've got any issues that will help clarify some of the points or areas that they want us to examine.
I love it. When you see the breadth of the people that watch our shows and the depth at which they think about the issues, and I read with huge interest actually what people put up. I don't know if you get the same on Frontline, but we 1 week we are Trump apologists, the next we are sort of the British arm of the Democrat Party. Some weeks we are naive about the dangers of Putin. Other weeks we are dangerously hawkish.
I think I get all those comments on a daily basis. So it's great. So we're getting the balance right. Yeah. July was a quiet month and there wasn't anything significant there. But August we then get into another busy time. Starting off with the Trump-Putin meeting in Alaska. Oh my goodness, was that Vladimir Putin coming out cock-a-hoop at the end of it going, this was brilliant, I've got everything that I want.
He nailed it. He got everything he wanted. He got the picture of him with Trump back at the global top table, like the good old days of the USSR-US summits that really did shape the world for the period that followed them.
He wasn't fazed by the F-22s flying overhead.
Some of the US, had the US got a better outcome from the meeting, then you might say that the US did a really good job of sort of overmatching the Russian delegation. But the fact is that the key purpose of a summit isn't the theatre, it's the outcome. And Putin played Trump like a fiddle.
And the result of that was we had panic in Europe and panic in NATO. And very quickly there was a NATO-European group of leaders who went off to the United States to set the conditions for Zelensky coming in. And Keir Starmer was part of setting all of this up. You're cementing the UK's importance in everything. How do you think that went? And from a former minister's perspective, how easy would it have been to set that sort of thing up so quickly and to achieve the effect that they achieved?
Well, it's a sign of the stakes that were on the table. Right? I mean, the fact that who was in the room? Merz, Macron, Meloni, Tusk, Starmer, Alexander Stubb, von der Leyen, Rutte, all there within 24 hours to react. Extraordinary. I mean, but I think people forget because we're almost now inoculated to it. Every few weeks, there's a kind of stop the world, massive moment happening. That was a really big deal for all those people to travel across the Atlantic to effectively try to unstitch.
Is that how we redefine in the future of Trump? stop the world and that thing. We just suffered a Trump.
I mean, it is extraordinary. I was listening to Alexander Stubb talking at the Helsinki Security Forum, and he's very modest, but Europe benefits a lot from him being such a good golfer.
Very much so, yeah.
Exactly. The business he gets done with Trump on the golf course is to all of our benefits.
Yeah.
Amazing. And then a few weeks later was the Pope's funeral, and we had that incredible picture, to contrast to the ambush in the Oval Office of Trump and Zelensky sat in the Vatican. And I thought that, make me a photo editor in a newspaper immediately, but just the enormity of the building, the two of them kind of high, it was just what a powerful
the
image.
humbleness of the two chairs and their heads bowed together, almost in reverence.
It gave me great hope.
Yes.
4 months later.
Well, the hope was still there, but we need some green shoots to try and say that is going to turn into something that's good. But in the hope bit, September, Donald Trump comes to the UK, second state visit. How important do you think that was in all of this and cementing UK's position with Trump and our influence over him?
I think it went really well. I know that in the US, and there'll be plenty of comments below that don't like the fact that we played up to Trump's perception of himself, and that we gave him a sort of royal treatment. But the United States is, without question, the most important UK partner. UK grand strategy has been for half a century and more, and will continue to be for a long time yet. A very, very simple grand strategy. Stay close to the United States. Yep. That's it. And the government did what needed to be done to deliver a renewal of that grand strategy, the special relationship. And I thought it was very, very, very well done.
Yeah, and that special relationship is critical. And the one thing that everyone identified was Trump loves the British pomp and circumstance, and being treated like that. And if you're trying to do a deal with someone, of course you're going to play up to what it is that they like, so that you can get out of it what you want. And from our perspective, it's influence.
Exactly. Although, by contrast, I do think that we've got it slightly wrong with the German president this week.
Yeah.
I spend a lot of my time when I'm in Germany, and particularly when I was a minister, but just saying that Zeitenwende is an extraordinary thing, this kind of big investment of money into German defence and security, that Germany is Europe's biggest economy, it is the biggest population, that Germany should be Europe's defence security leader. But it's been atoning for what happened in the first half of the last century for a lifetime since. And that sense that they need to continue atoning holds them back. And I think that it's in the UK's strategic interest to encourage Germany to be ever more confident. And so to send him up to Coventry Cathedral to sort of lay a wreath and atone once again, I just thought was the wrong end to the visit.
I couldn't agree with you more. And it's interesting, I served in Germany a lot. And I can't remember the year. You might be a football fan and know, but it was the year of the German World Cup, when they hosted the World Cup. And during that, the German football commentators were not debating the potential outcome of the World Cup, and not debating World Cup football tactics and all the rest of it. All of their commentators and their sports commentators through the whole of German television were debating whether the world would be upset at all of the Germans flying the German flags from the car and this rise of nationalism. And I was in a NATO headquarters and talking to my German counterparts and all the rest of it. They were really worried. Before that, at every time they'd apologised for the Second World War and what the Germans did to the Jews and everything else. But when that World Cup came in and the debate came in, and they suddenly realised that, no, everyone is actually thinking this is a good thing. And it's good for Germany to come out. And you could see with the commentary, all of a sudden, it was like the blind seeing again. And things changed. And we saw an uplift in German nationalism from a positive perspective, not the negative bit. And you could see this sense of relief going throughout the population. And it was fantastic.
I mean, it is to tie this in with the conversation we've been having about the year in review. I mean, where Trump and Vance and Hegseth and Rubio and the US Congress have been pushing constantly is in the need for Europe to do more to secure itself. Germany is an inescapably important part.
Yes.
The UK and France have the nuclear deterrent, but what Germany and Poland are doing to invest in their conventional forces, and to a lesser degree in terms of scale, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, Finland, Sweden, but Poland and Germany particularly are the bedrock of this European conventional military renaissance. And I think it's great that the German president has come and has been given the welcome he's been given, but we need to be pushing Germany to lead even more.
It gives us that foundation, and that foundation, Trump the whole way through, it's all about the deal. And come October, Trump gets his first deal. He gets the Israel-Gaza ceasefire deal. How significant do you think that was? And we're not saying Gaza being rebuilt into this paradise that Donald Trump had with his estate and his building hat on and thought it was going to turn into.
So, it just goes to show that sometimes the normal mechanisms for diplomacy still have their place, because that initial sort of, hey, here's the answer to Gaza, Gaza Riviera. And I do, in fairness, remember, and you'll be a much more eloquent commentator on this than I, but people say that the real difference at the end of the Troubles in Northern Ireland is when the prosperity of the communities, house values, sort of sense of pride and place, all of a sudden people are deterred from fighting and rioting and everything else because they've got something to lose. Mm-hmm. So in that sense, the idea of a prosperous Gaza on this prime real estate in the Eastern Mediterranean, it had some merit. But my gosh, the reaction of the Arab world was pretty unsurprising, but
Trump
was pretty fierce. He did get, fast forward 10 months, he's got a deal, one that is much more sensible, one that is underpinned by Arab League support.
At the same time that month, we had the US carry out its first strikes against Venezuelan suspected drug barons and declaration of narco-terrorism, which is a new phrase that came in, and US military being used to an effect that has caused some international legal consternation.
So look, I'm a bit nervous that in a minute or two's time we're going to have to make some prediction for 2026. And
I think we might well have
to. If we'd been sat in these seats a year ago, and either one of us had said that by the autumn of 2025 there will be a US carrier strike group in the Caribbean posturing to start a war with Venezuela, it would have sounded absurd.
Someone would have said, "You're sacked. Get out."
And yet here we are. So God on earth knows where we'll be in a year's time.
Well, we'll talk that as a possibility in a minute, because it may happen before Christmas, so it might not fit into 2026. But before we get onto that, the final bit up to our recording date is we've got this 28-point plan that Russia presented to America. Witkoff presented it as an American solution. That came down to, what was it, a 24-point plan, and then a 19-point plan that was been taken back to the United States. That Witkoff then took to Putin, and Putin went, nah. What's your reading?
I can't say. I think the two sides are too far apart, and I think that Zelensky has been weakened by the corruption scandals. I think losing Yermak is a problem for him. I think the message that it sends to the US Congress and the US public, it will affirm many of their fears about the Ukrainian effort, and I worry that Zelensky is in an ever more difficult position, both in terms of his own political standing as well as militarily. But I still think the sides are so far apart, and that the Europeans can't support Zelensky in a capitulation. He can't do that either. It just, I would put my neck out and say, not only by the time it's this broadcast, there hasn't been a peace deal, but I have a horrible feeling that even in 2026 there won't be.
I don't think that's putting our neck out at all, and I think there's a real danger that if Zelensky is forced to give up territory, even temporarily, that the message that will send out to the likes of Xi Jinping,
Exactly.
who will turn around and go, well, I can withstand the wrath of the international community for just under 4 years, quite easy, and I'm the second largest economy, so it won't even be 4 years. I'm taking Taiwan. And the message that sends out elsewhere is frightening, and Vladimir Putin will go, this is brilliant, I've got my time to now rebuild my military, learn the lessons, build up my relationships with China, and get an awful lot better kit in, get my people back online and come back for another salami slice in a few years' time. That's what people don't seem to realise.
Yeah, I agree.
So we're now getting into 2026 and looking forward. Or it could be the latter half of 2025 over Christmas, because the fighting doesn't stop. But end of February 2026, we are 4 years into the Ukraine war. From a tactical perspective, 4 years. During the Second World War, Russia pushed the Germans back from the outskirts of Moscow to the outskirts of Berlin. In that 4 years, Russia has lost its strategic objective of toppling the Kyiv government, lost taking Ukraine completely, lost its strategic objective of NATO expansionism or stopping NATO expansionism, and has advanced about 40 kilometres in the east as a tertiary objective. And
paid a huge price.
At huge price, and its economy is collapsing.
Yeah, and its reliance on China has become ever greater, to the point that Putin is a client of Xi, which is a heck of a price to pay.
What sort of mortgage do you think Putin is having to pay to Xi, and do you think that's going to be for a long, long time to come?
I do. I mean, the thing that I think comes out of it all is Chinese presence in the Russian Arctic and resources and all that sort of stuff, I think. But it is. Make no mistake, the war will stop immediately if Xi tells Putin to stop. She doesn't. I think, and there'll be all sorts of reasons why that's the case. But it's, in so many ways, Russia has already strategically lost.
Yeah.
And yet it hasn't.
Yes.
And the war goes on, and we underestimate Russian resolve, I fear, and we just need to knuckle down for, to keep matching.
But do you think this time next year we're going to sit in the pub again and saying, well, here's what happened in Ukraine in 2026, and we're looking forward to 2027, and there'll still be fighting?
Well, I wouldn't say looking forward to, but yeah, I do. I think in a year's time we will still be talking about a live kinetic war between Russia and Ukraine, in Ukraine, with front lines that will be barely 100, 200 miles at most from where they are at the moment. Will
Trump still be engaged, do you think?
No. I think there's every chance he'll move on. And people did warn me. It was on an episode of Superpowers. It might have been Heather Conley, who was Assistant Secretary of State in the George W. Bush administration, and she pulled out the fact that in Trump 1 he was going to get a deal with North Korea, and then it didn't happen. He just moves on, it just on to the next thing. And I've used that in so many speeches and bits of commentary since. It's so true. My prediction for next year, because I think there's a responsibility to be bold.
Yep.
My prediction for next year is that something fired by NATO will shoot down something belonging to Russia.
Okay. I can see that happening easily, but I don't see that inflaming things. My prediction.
No, I think it will it will pass.
Yeah.
Because it will just be part of life.
Exactly.
Ridiculous.
I think my prediction for next year is that we're going to see an uptick across the west of Russian operations in the grey zone. So we're going to see more potential assassinations. We're going to see more sabotage going on. We're going to see more political stirring the pot and unrest, especially in the UK when we come to the local government elections. There will certainly be influence coming in and information operations going on. I think tactically, Pokros will have gone. Ukraine will have fixed Russia yet again in another city, and Russia will be losing hundreds of thousands of people trying to take another urban place, and Ukraine will continue to attack the Russian economy and Russia's ability to continue to finance the war. Europe might be bold enough to properly use the $300 billion of Russian assets to support Ukraine. If that happens, and we discussed this a lot in Frontline with Bill Browder, if that happens, it will be significant and have a significant impact on Vladimir Putin and his oligarchs, because that's their money and they want it back. But I still think the fighting, unfortunately, will be going on through 2026 and potentially into 2027.
Philip, the clock is ticking down rapidly, but the other thing I'd love to get your thoughts on is, by the end of next year, we will be going into either the final year of Xi's presidency. Lots of people talk about war in the Pacific in 2028. Is 2027 going to be the year when the PLA Navy preparations really take off and it becomes clear that there is going to be some sort of forced reunification of China?
Do you want to know a mad thing? About 25 years ago, I had a bet with a friend of mine who works for Associated Press and said to her, there's going to be a war, rare earth in Southeast Asia. Rare earth metals are going to be at the core of it, and it'll be focused on Taiwan. And we have a bear as the bet on it, and I'm afraid I am probably going to win it. And there's some indicators that are in there. If you look at some of what I describe as the funnies, like the Second World War funnies, but in Chinese terms, with Xi Jinping, we've got these massive floating docks that have got ramps on them that are 100 meters long, that are designed for one thing: over beach maneuvering and bringing logistics in. Very expensive to build, very expensive to maintain, and they've only got one use. At the same time, we're getting all of the ferries and civilian shipping in China being deliberately designed for dual use, for military use as well. And China is building up its power projection capability with its carrier groups. It's launched its third carrier. It's building more submarines and everything else. This is extremely expensive, and you don't build it up just to keep it sitting there. You build it up to use it. And the one thing that Xi Jinping has been consistent on is saying he will take Taiwan back by force. And if the West turns around and gives any indication of weakness in Ukraine, he might do that. But also in 2027, 2028, looking forward, we're coming up to the end of Donald Trump's presidency at a time when he would have difficulty in potentially reacting, and the difficulties that are in there.
And midterms in November, which may change the complexion of US politics.
Correct. And therefore Xi is watching that very closely indeed. I don't think he wants to take Taiwan by force. He wants to force Taiwan to capitulate because he's driven by economics. But if he thinks that he needs to do something using his military to try and force global economics, if he thinks that by doing that, the economic shock it would cause would push the United States from being the first, the top power in the world, and allow China to take that position over, he might just do it.
God, we've not exactly oozed festive cheer.
We have
Merry freaking Christmas.
Yes, and I think we just need to finish on a positive note. We've got Christmas. We've got us doing analysis on what's going on. So if people want to come and properly understand the depressing nature that the world is in at the moment, we've got Superpowers and we've got Frontline. So that's a positive.
It is. And look, I just want how grateful I am that these people come on every week and onto Frontline and onto Superpowers and give everything from high academic analysis of what's gone before through to sort of scuttlebutt and gossip from their capitals. Okay. And of course, sometimes you can sort of think that one is more valuable than the other, but so much of geopolitics and politics in general is about personality and personal grievances and motivations, and then set that in the context. I think that I enjoy watching Frontline enormously, and we're both very fortunate to get the contributors that we do, and most importantly, hugely fortunate to have this incredible global audience
that listen in, and that's the most important. Our guests are superb. The audience are the best bit of all of it.
They are.
So, for the audience, should we wish them a Merry Christmas?
Very, very Merry Christmas.
A very, very Merry Christmas. And of course, you can get us on your favourite podcast channels. Just search for Times Radio Frontline or Times Radio Superpowers. And please sign up and subscribe because you'll get some of our content more exclusively and be able to put comments in that we'll then try and use to formulate our programs for next year.
Absolutely.
Brilliant.
What a pleasure.
A real pleasure.
Can I just say one last thank you before we go? People who won't know that behind the camera are a team of fantastic producers who do a great job producing all of this content. So thank you and Merry Christmas to them. And let's look forward to another brilliant year next year.
Hear, hear, and I echo that completely. You've been watching Frontline with me, Philip Ingram. If you'd like access to exclusive content, please subscribe to Times Radio membership and watch us on YouTube. But you can now get us as a podcast wherever you get your podcasts from. And don't forget, you can also listen to Times Radio for the latest updates on global affairs and read about them at thetimes.com. Thank you.